If you're anything like me, you probably sometimes want to know where my shirt is. Maybe that information was mentioned in a podcast somewhere, but how are you going to find it? Are you going to personally watch all the episodes of The Integral Stage and all the adjacent meta community podcasts, hoping to stumble on the information? Don't be stupid. That's too long of time. How would you even know you're checking the right podcasts? Instead, go to the Apple App Store on the internets and get Fathom.fm. Fathom.fm is a meta podcast platform that not only figures out which podcasts you should be listening to, but which parts of those podcasts contain the answers to the questions you're interested in. Fathom.fm is making podcasts searchable, instantly chapterizable, and transcribable, and training up teams of suspiciously intelligent AIs to do the work for us. The digital universe is becoming curated by conversations and interfaced with through automated dialogue processes. So, if you want to put yourself in the best position for digital synchronicity and distributed sense making this year, you may have to submit to our robot masters. Ask your doctor if cyborg interfacing is right for you. Fathom.fm. I do it.
Hey, folks, if indeed you are folks, I'm Layman Pascal, if indeed that's a thing. And you might recall we spoke before with Aydan Connor on the Integral Stage. It was one of the first of our Integral Everyman discussions for the Liminal Cafe series. We explored his history and interests relative to meta communities of integrative pluralism, the ongoing transformation of identity, and the situation of a society that needs to evolve rapidly toward a new, healthy developmental stability. And while he promised me some craft beer I didn't end up getting, I enjoyed that conversation a lot, and I was intrigued by his interest in the theory and practice of new food systems. So it's been a while. Seemed like we should check back in and see how those ideas have been growing and developing, where they still could go, what they might be leaving out, and what would be needed to take them to the next level. It's even possible that someone listening right now also thinks food systems are a key area for cultural upgrade and wants to get involved. Hi, Aiden. Good to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
What do you see today about food systems that you didn't see clearly a year ago?
Well, I would say that one of the things that I see today is I've been able to do a little bit more research as far as like causes of failures in the food system, the relative issues as far as like what farmers are seeing, what consumers are seeing, what producers are seeing. And so it's kind of for me the situation has actually become more extreme in my mind as I've learned more and more about it. The biggest thing that kind of came about in my research that has really like deeply made this a salient issue is the level of waste that is in the system. So one of the things that I sensed just from my personal experience, my day-to-day life, interacting with other people about their relationship with food, was that there's just like a lot of waste going on in the system. And yeah, it's about the estimates are as high as 50% of all food, which means actual consumable food, not like, scraps and stuff that's like left behind in preparation. And I think the lowest estimate I've seen is 30%. And originally, I was also wondering how much of this was a United States specific issue, because that was something that I wondered with the way that we structure food distribution, the way that farming is done here, whether that was feeding into the issue. And unfortunately, I found that it's pretty international. It's very, very much an international issue, and the United States actually isn't the worst culprit in the grand scheme of things. So the worst, as far as the stats that I was able to find, were the UK, Australia, and I think I can't remember the last one that was in the top three. But
I noticed the
you know,
top three are all English-speaking countries.
yeah. What's up with that? What's up with that? Maybe that's what it is. So yeah, I guess like the big thing for me is where I was seeing kind of this limited scope previously, and it just kind of bothered me. Like I started being bothered a lot by how much food I would end up throwing out of my own fridge. and just talking to people about how much they were throwing out, and then to realize like, hey, this isn't just an isolated thing. This is something that very much seems like a systemic issue from everything that I've been able to find in the last year. So yeah, that's where I'm at with all of it. I think looking at the places where food waste is happening is actually really helpful to be able to understand the issue. And so, in looking into that, what I found was that half of all the food waste in total is from household refrigerators. So, you can interpret that multiple ways. And I have kind of like probably 3 or 4 reasons I can think of why that's happening. The first reason is just simple lack of planning. So I think some people just aren't thinking about what they're purchasing their food for, or let's say another reason might be they have a plan and then that plan falls through for whatever reason. And then the third reason I can think of is that the food is basically on the brink of spoiling by the time that it gets to the fridge, right? And then I don't know if I actually have a fourth distinct reason now that I'm thinking of it, but overall, I think that there's kind of like an attitude sometimes that can sneak in where people just don't even realize the volume of the food that they're throwing out. So I think some of it has to do with just a lack of awareness. What was interesting was that when I looked into the issue as far as food waste, I did find that there were some government attempts in the United States, at least, to try to increase awareness around the issue. This was around 2015, and everything. I think the report I was reading was from about 2017, so it had been a couple of years since this effort had been put forward. And from everything that I was seeing in surveys, people are aware of the issue, concerned about the issue. Like I think something like 75% of people said that this issue matters to them, but it's still happening. Basically, that's what the report is saying. So this is the point in my research where it becomes even more clear that this is a systemic issue rather than being. I think a lot of people think it's just an education issue, or like people are too lazy to cook their own food, or like whatever. But what I found in my own house was that my wife and I are literally too busy. Like that's what happens. Like there's something about the way that modern life has been structured so that unless you have a particular life situation where you can devote that time and energy towards cooking your food, I think it's actually like the cards are stacked against people. And so it's become much more of a social structural concern of mine, and made the salience of coming up with some kind of alternative structure even more intense for me. So essentially, I think that we need to stop pointing fingers when it comes to the issue, like who's doing what to make food waste happen, and come together. I think that really ultimately what needs to happen is that we come together in communities with a shared attention and intention surrounding food production so that we can better collaborate with each other to reduce food waste overall. Um, so there's a variety of kind of structural changes that I think what's difficult for me is that like it all requires investment. All of this requires real capital investment. And what I've seen in the craft beer industry, which is where I'm coming from in this situation, is that there's a lot of like kind of motivated reasoning when it comes to small business owners in what they consider worth the risk, which is fine. Like that makes sense. Like they're the ones who are taking the risk on. But it it's kind of disappointing. It's been a very disappointing thing to see from kind of like the production side, just how easy it is for business owners to kind of just poo-poo different kinds of waste management systems that they might be able to integrate, different ways of kind of actually being more experimental in what they're trying to produce. So essentially, like really what seems to happen is that there's a bit of a passing of the buck when it comes to um, production, generally speaking, and that goes for everything from beer through food, where every part of the supply chain is kind of like only aware of and considers themselves responsible for just that isolated part that they play a role in. And it just ends up being that everybody kind of seems to be doing their best guess to best job of guessing what people actually want. And one of the bigger structural changes that I think needs to happen is that guesswork needs to be reduced significantly. That guesswork is really where the waste is coming from in a lot of ways. So again, this shared intention and attention surrounding food, I think would do a lot to solve this. So the big thing that I think can kind of be a major shift in resolving at least some of the issues would just be better communication. So, I know that the concepts of distributed cognition and collective consciousness and stuff are something that come up a lot in the liminal web space. My suggestion is basically that there's ways that we can structurally integrate these as models to be able to do better production. So the idea being that I guess like one good way of kind of approaching this, I was just listening to an interview with a gentleman. I wish I could remember what his specific specialty is, but he basically studies early life emergence, so origins of life. And one of the concepts that he has put forward as far as like a potential model for how evolution essentially got kickstarted before evolution existed is this concept of PIM. And it's an acronym. I believe P is for proximity. So essentially, like the actual proximity of, or the, one other way to put it would be concentration. If you're talking chemically, that the higher the concentration, the higher the closer the proximity in a system, that's kind of like one of the elements that can generate an evolutionary like process. The second one being which I think has to do with networking, so information and information transfer. So there's some way that networking needs to happen in addition to the proximity. And then the last thing, M. I wish I could remember. I wish I had written these down. Anyways, M is basically the memory. Memory. Yeah, there you go. That's a funny one to forget, huh? So the memory part of it is kind of the last thing to tie it all together. What I think has happened is basically we have we have a very, very limited amount of networking that's happening, but our proximity is kind of out of whack. We're not really existing in cohesive geographical communities anymore. And I think that the memory part is kind of significant because what I see in this waste issue is basically that these are all loose ends, essentially. These are all ways that like that memory is only kind of carried forward so far and then it dissipates, if that makes sense. So where the producer of a particular product may be able to sell all of that product to a distributor. And then that distributor is able to distribute all of that product to, various grocery stores, what have you. There's no real like way of returning that information as far as what ends up being purchased, what ends up being wasted back into the system to better inform the system of how to improve the process in the future. So what I think we need to do is basically try to construct something that reflects along the lines of that PIM model to be able to essentially create more coherent communities that support each other through a food system through caring about land management and to integrate and find better ways of essentially tying up those loose ends in terms of food distribution and management.
So the problem is not particular nations. The problem is the like modern system of food production and distribution in general. And it's suffering primarily from a collective sense-making problem among the people involved in the different functional components of that system. I mean, one of the things about the modern system is long supply chains. People want to be able to quickly and efficiently get things from distant places. And yet you bring up this issue of proximity. Like, can we resolve this at the scale of food distribution that we have? Or do we have to accept a reduction to local systems that have the proximity that could enable that sense making?
I think something that is important to me is not being, basically, don't let the perfect be the enemy of your food. That's one of the heuristics that I have. And that's because what I've seen in a lot of like the alternative food movements has a lot to, it kind of like smacks of purity. And I think that there's a lot that you end up leaving behind in terms of your models if you insist on, it has to be all local. It has to be, it has to all be organic. It has to be all regenerative. Like these kind of narrow-minded approaches are, I think, a big part of why those movements haven't actually like gained more traction over the decades. So I do think that there is most likely always going to be some long supply chains that exist in production. And I think that there's benefit and utility to having distribution when it comes to goods that are literally not producible outside of specific geographical regions. So I think like to some extent, we should consider the idea of having essentially a resurgence of the idea of a spice trade. Like something where it's these are things, these are flavors, these are specific items that are precious to us that we want to be able to share with communities outside of a local region. So there's that end of it. There's also the food security end of it. So I don't think that it's wrong for people to want to make sure that those in regions where it's not going to be easy to produce food locally are going to have access. Like they need to have access to food from elsewhere. And I don't think that it would be right to presume that everybody's going to want to shift into a localized model in the first place. I don't think that there's a way to grow something like this from the top down. It really has to be something that comes from within communities and grows from those communities itself.
The phrase "don't let the perfect be the enemy of the food" is terrific.
Okay, good.
I like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's important. We need food, Gotta have it.
It seems like all this necessitates that at least in a larger number of people, there's a greater consciousness of the overall system rather than just seeing their own role in that system. It's not that everybody has to see the whole system, but we must need a lot more people who have a more whole view of all the parts of that system functioning. And so I have some curiosities around how we develop that. One of the things that leapt out to me immediately is, and this is because I'm like this, I often don't respond to things I can't see. I have this problem with my own fridge, is that if things go in the crisper, they never come out because I don't see them, and so they rot. Yeah. So I had to get rid of the crisper, right? But there's a similar problem when I go to the grocery store. It's arranged kind of ornamentally to seduce me into it. I don't see the food delivery trucks arriving. All right. It's a lot of the aspects of the food system are made opaque so that I don't see them. And as a result, I don't form any feelings or conclusions about them. So I wonder what that is, how we get more people to see more aspects of the system so that they can then take more of it into account and interact with each other on the basis of that overview.
It's a tough issue because I do think that it is structurally intentional that that opacity exists. Like I do think that this is not something that has happened by accident. And unfortunately, I think that there's really something that needs to shift when it comes to the prioritization in focusing on just how our lives get to be our lives. Just generally, like, how we get to thrive on the systems that have been set up for us to some extent. Um, but yeah, I think education has got to be part of it. But like I said, I think that past the education, there's some extent to which people are kind of like, well, what else? Like, what can I actually do about that? And I think that's kind of a fair question, in particular for people who don't have access to like local CSAs, things like co-ops, farmers markets, all these kind of alternative options that some people have access to. They're not ubiquitous. We don't have anything like that in my area, and I'm literally surrounded by farms. Like there's farms everywhere around. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a really good question as far as like how to actually get people to care about it, and to become aware of it. I think just like being in the position that I'm in, I one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to do is to just by speaking about this, by bringing awareness to it, that will at least kind of start laying the groundwork for more awareness of that. I do have kind of like an overarching concept that I'm working on called post anthropocentric ecological stewardship. And a lot of that is centered on the idea that we need to just kind of like reevaluate our focus in how we look at land use overall. And so that's something it's I don't know. I don't have the answers, Layman. I don't have the answers for that, as far as like how to generate the awareness other than just by trying to talk about it.
Well, that's got to be the first step. I mean, you got to start where you are. Um,
Yeah.
I can imagine, and maybe this even exists out there somewhere, the same way people go on bird watching or mushroom hunting expeditions, that they might gather in an educational way to take a tour of different aspects of the food system within their community. And that might be something that communities or schools even could get behind if it was sort of set up.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Like some kind of tours of local farms, if they're around. Like one of the things that kind of is bizarre to me, and I've thought a lot about this, is I know that food production facilities exist within my region. They might not be close by, but I've never seen one. I've never walked into one. I don't know how big they are. I don't know all the food that they're producing there. So yeah, I think there's like a lot of kind of lack of access that I'm actually curious to see if I can find a place like that. If I were to ask them to do a tour, if they would be willing to let me into their facility and basically show me around. I think like from the craft brewers end of things, I know that it became a really popular thing at any craft brewery to be able to offer tours. People want to be able to see behind the scenes. They know the equipment's there. They know that something's happening back there, and they're just interested in learning a little bit more about it. And I think that's useful. I think that's good. And I honestly like one of the things that I feel pretty strongly about is that we actually have a right to this. Like we should have a right to be able to see how our food is being produced. We should have access to that information. And that's not to say like I need to know like what was the name of this chicken before it was killed and when was it born and where did it die and like what was it, all those details, all that. I think that's kind of like a weird way of looking at it. I think really the information that's important is has to come has to do much more with the how of all of it. How was this chicken killed? You know, how was it, like, what was the slaughterhouse like? What was it treated with? What was the carcass treated with after it was killed to be able to prepare it for packaging? Like, what kind of chemicals are on this thing that I just got from the store? And so I don't know. I mean, I think we've become very we've kind of acquiesced to this idea that that we don't need to know all of this information, that it's not important. And I think like the downside to that is that it really does allow for a lot of kind of, I don't know what else to call it, like mischief making, I guess, when it comes to production end of things. Just like a kind of tangential example of this is that in my own workspace, and by the way, I should probably mention that I'm not speaking for my work at all. I'm not going to mention the name of the place, but just like for the record, this is my own opinion, blah, blah, blah. But at my own workplace, like, we're literally doubling production next year. And that has to do with there's like basically contractual arrangements that we have with other producers to produce their product for them. So we have like this huge expansion in production that's happening. We've got new tanks coming in, new equipment, and all of that. And yet, I have a coworker who's going to be leaving his job at the brewery after working there for 7 years because, frankly, no one's willing to pay. So it's an issue. It becomes an issue about labor as well. Like when it comes to our food system, we just kind of are opaque to all of these happenings as far as how it gets to the grocery store shelf. And I don't know. I mean, I think COVID did reveal that there's a lot of discontent when it comes to food production. There's a lot of strikes that I was hearing about when it came to big processor. Like I think there was one at Kellogg's, cereal producer. Um, and I think there were a few others I can't think of off the top of my head, but you know, these bigger production facilities, the more you scale up, the more that the people involved just become kind of like cogs in a machine. And so I think that there's a lot of room for considering how we want to have our food system structured when it comes to the labor end of things as well. And really like the this is another aspect of bringing this into a localized community that I think could really benefit. I think it would be a lot harder for people to stomach low wages for those who are making their food for them if they knew what those wages were, for example. I think that if there was a way of constructing it so that the community itself can recognize the work that's being done and attempt to compensate people in a way that is, you know, if they're living in the same community, you approximately know how much is a reasonable wage. And the idea that my food is being made for me in a way that I have no part in basically the good that is being generated out of that process. I think that's really unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate that everybody doesn't really get to play a larger role in how that takes shape.
So how much of a role then might unions, unionization, and organized labor play in this in terms of providing a check against corporate efficiency and in terms of trying to secure wages and well-being for the people who are involved in this and trying to secure increased say into the process of production on the part of the workers and communities?
Yeah, that came up in my conversation with my coworker about his decision to leave. You know, it's kind of like goes back to this being a real systemic issue. I think at least in the United States, the pushback against unions is strong enough that it kind of requires more than what most people have in their time and energy budget to be able to organize in that way. So I know that's kind of like a little bit of a cop out, but I have a lot of skepticism about the utility of unions when, again, people are having a hard time finding time to even make a meal at the end of the day. I don't know how that turns into time to also organize um, and be able to actually gain some kind of collective power in the face of corporate power. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but I'm pretty skeptical about unions.
Yeah, it's a
So
tricky one because like even if we imagine a scenario where a union was capable of securing more time and energy for people, they would need more time and energy up front to be involved in that, provided
yeah,
they trusted the process. And that seems to be a general difficulty here. Like whether we're thinking of unions or not, where are people going to get the extra time and energy to consider, learn about, and engage with each other to undertake transformations of the food system?
right. So one of the missions that I have is essentially what I think needs to happen is that there needs to be some kind of model that people can work off of. So what you find, like just to illustrate how this functions in the brewing industry, when craft beer started being a thing, it was this total anomalous oddity. They had to basically repurpose equipment from other industries and cobble it together to be able to create brewing systems. They had to create new legislation to be able to manage distribution at a different scale. There were, limits in terms of distribution of ingredients and access to ingredients. So, and there was also just kind of a lack of awareness of beer being anything other than macro beer. So like adjunct lagers, basically in the United States. What ended up happening is basically because of the success of craft beer, there's kind of like, where this was this cobbled together thing. Eventually, it starts becoming this very structured, very replicable thing. And so when I would encounter people who were trying to open up a brewery, what they typically are doing is they're going to different breweries in the region, checking out how they did things, checking out, you know, essentially how they set up their tap room, how did they set up their equipment in the back, what kind of equipment do they have, what do they like about it, what don't they like about it, how do they get over these hurdles. These are all questions that can be answered in a variety of ways by a variety of people because the industry exists. But there's a lot of difficulty in that transition period to be able to get to that point. What I think could really bootstrap this whole thing is if we can create basically a focus intention in a few communities to create systems, alternative food systems, and essentially to make it open source so that any kind of information that they're able to glean from that process, any lessons that they're learning, the whole purpose is to share it with the other communities who are attempting this thing, essentially to try to speed up that process of creating these models. I think like flexible models are definitely important. They need to be tailored to whatever kind of conditions exist in the community itself. But having that groundwork, that kind of basic model could really make a big difference when it comes to adoption of a new kind of system. So something I haven't touched on yet is that I do think that information technology will be extremely critical in terms of implementing something as local as what I'm considering. This is the system I'm considering generally.
Yeah, I imagine there'd be a significant role for something like apps to favor sources and projects that sort of sign on and get vetted by some kind of open source network of providers. One of the things that stood out to me, like thinking about COVID, and COVID seems like an opportunity for people to realize frailties of the system they're in.
Yeah.
supply line problems, the importance of grocery store workers, all this stuff became a little bit more salient for us, but there's a good chance we forget about it. In your PIM example, we have a real memory hole for a lot of these things.
Yeah.
What is it that we can do to instantiate memory into the structure of the system more effectively?
We need to create more we need to create more secure ties with each other. All of this. So I know you speak regularly with Greg Enriquez. He talks a lot about the idea that there's this chaotic pluralism, this fractured kind of condition that we're in generally as a culture, and that we need to start moving towards coherence in terms of pluralism. So I think that shit, I totally lost my train of thought. What was your question again?
How do we instantiate memory into the
Yeah,
system?
right. Memory. So a lot of yeah, right. So instantiating memory into the system really just has to do with creating, like going back to the information technology part of it. I think that having an app would really make a huge difference when it comes to creating an avenue for that memory. So, you've got like kind of review websites like Yelp and whatever else. And that's kind of a weird way that the internet has attempted to create like some kind of a memory in terms of consumers in their experience, and that can feed back into the actual business or whatever that's being reviewed, more or less. I think that model is like, it is what it is. There's a lot of flaws in it, but I think that if you take that and essentially structure it so that it is part of a system, that kind of memory can really inform the actual producers over time. And so, where you know somebody might go to a restaurant, they have a bad experience, they write a review, they might never go back to that restaurant. That information may never be used by that restaurant in any way. It may or may not be useful information in the first place. If you have a system where basically that that person is a member of this community, they're invested in the community, their attention is focused on that community, the dynamic shifts. You have more ownership over that opinion, you have more ownership over that information. And I think as you build trust in a system that is community based, that only kind of amplifies over time. I think that like there's a better way that producers can essentially respect their customers, respect their community, and that integrating that memory as a part of the system rather than an aberration to the system should be what the focus is. So one of the stories that I've heard through a gentleman who worked as a millwright for a couple of decades kind of illustrates this to me as far as like how the current system treats memory. At Kraft Foods, Kraft Foods, they do like the mac and cheese boxes, right? And they started receiving these complaints about these little blue flecks that were showing up in with their macaroni. They come to realize that the blue flakes are from the giant conveyor belt that runs through their production facility, starting to degrade, and so these flecks are, getting in with the macaroni. This gentleman goes in to replace the conveyor belt. And what do you think the color of the conveyor belt was?
I
The
mean, blue
same as
would be the obvious choice.
the same color as the macaroni. The
Uh,
same color of the macaroni. That's how the system works now. They want it to be opaque. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want that memory to come back, that information to come back into form of memory, right? So this is why I'm so disturbed. What'd you say?
Now, when it breaks down, no one will notice.
Yeah, exactly. Now when it breaks down, no one will notice. They won't receive any complaints.
That's a solution the shareholders can get behind.
Exactly. Exactly. So I mean, like, there's just like there's so much. I think that there's like way more fuckery that's happening in the system than we can even know at this point. And so, and a lot of that has to do with just like this distance that people who are producing that scale can like create in their mind between themselves and their intentions and these people who are consuming their product. Like, they don't care that people are just like consuming little bits of whatever plastic material this is. That's just it's just it kind of like boggles the mind when you start to like really think about these issues. So yeah, anyways, that's what I think. I think that illustrates where we're at right now, and the ways that I really think that the system needs to, there just needs to be an alternative, essentially. I think it's too easy. The game, it's too easy to game the system at this moment.
There's sometimes when I think about meta level integrative game B type solutions, I try to imagine what left and right look like in those scenarios. And one of the ways for me to make sense of that is to think of sort of independent, localized alternatives, a bit like communities and small projects, versus attempts to manipulate the top-down structure of the system to create a more amenable framework for these things. And they need to work together somehow. The
Hmm.
alternatives aren't going to really work if the system's totally against them, but you can't just change the system. You've got to provide some alternatives. And
Yeah.
so we've been talking a lot about setting up these alternative possibilities. When I think about the overall system, I think about, because we were just talking about the fuckery that might be involved. How does a society more intelligently manage its oversight of food production, right? The Americans have the FDA, which has prevented some things, but it's also been in cahoots with some very bad things over time.
Hmm.
It's hard to feel trust for them. And certainly it's unpleasant to feel like the sheer amount of regulation is going to be increased. At the
Yeah.
same time, who's in a position to stop people from allowing plastic into our macaroni?
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, how do you
Yeah.
think about generalized regulation of food systems?
I think there's I hate to be a Debbie Downer, but I do think that it's inherently flawed. I just don't think that there's I don't think that there's any way to produce at such a large scale without letting things go wrong. Eventually, in some way or fashion, whether or not it ends up being something that people know about or not. One of the things that happened during COVID was actually, it might have been towards the tail end. It wasn't too long ago, but you might have heard about the baby formula um, issue that was going on for a while in the United States. So there was, I think, two, maybe three facilities in the entire country that manage production of baby formula. And a lot of that has to do with the intense regulations about how baby formula has to be produced because of the health risk, because it's such an extreme situation if things go wrong. Now, it only takes one bad process in one out of three facilities to cause multiple deaths, to make it so that all of these families are basically at risk of not being able to feed their babies. And I think that that's just this is kind of like a too big to fail kind of situation that is actually like creating a lot more risk in the system than it's helping. So I think it's tricky because the high regulations are part of what feed into there only being three facilities that do this thing in an entire country. But because of that limited number of producers, like, it just takes so little for things to go wrong for it to be catastrophic. So, as far as regulations are concerned, what I would say is I'm not sure how it would function on the large scale production, but I do think that small scale localized food production would actually lend itself very well to food safety standards being increased. That might be counterintuitive to some people, but the fact of the matter is, and again, I'm pulling from my experience in the brewing industry and seeing what has happened there over time. In the almost 10 years that I've been in craft beer, there's been an explosion of testing equipment that has been made, has been created, and basically designed specifically for smaller brewers to be able to utilize in-house. You know, there's a concept that basically in production you have these critical control points where if you don't meet certain standards, these are basically safety measures and quality measures to be able to ensure that, okay, at this stage of the process, we've met this standard. Now we can move on to the next stage. And at every point, they're utilizing testing equipment. They're doing something to be able to verify in real time what's happening. That is a much better model than having regulations which basically preclude whatever you can and cannot do in theory, but in practice, there's not somebody who's necessarily going to be standing there all the time watching what's happening. And the scenarios where they set something like that up on the large scale are some of our worst culprits when it comes to food production, like slaughterhouses, USDA slaughterhouses. They have people who are there literally watching the process to verify that things are being done by regulation. You know, that means that there's only so many slaughterhouses. That means that the animals have to be transported a ridiculous distance in many cases to be able to even get to the slaughterhouse. So there's a lot of ways that regulations, different ways that you look at it, are really just meaning that players have to be bigger to be able to manage the regulation. And production needs to be centralized in order to manage regulation. So what I think needs to happen is essentially we need to see this testing equipment being made available, accessible for small producers to be able to verify that their food is safe for themselves and that the quality is high for themselves in-house in real time. I think that doing audits and having traceability is much better done internally than it is done by regulation externally. And I think that communities should be able to decide for themselves what those standards might be. Obviously, it needs to be an informed decision, but I just don't see. I think regulation just has severe limits. I think that it will always exist to some extent. It's going to be more or less successful in certain applications, but generally speaking, it leads to centralization and it leads to the failures being so severe by comparison. So yeah, I mean, I think that internal testing is really the way of the future.
There's a problem with a kind of narrowness and fragility in the food system. And you're saying one of the factors that creates scale and centralization and a limited number of sourcing options is regulation, although there's other factors that contribute to that as well. But it seems like this narrowness is a problem sort of all around. Like you were mentioning at the beginning, how much of the waste comes from home refrigerators. And I was trying to think, well, when do I throw things out? You know, very often it's a decision to downgrade the status of leftovers in favor of a new concept for food. And usually that's because I don't know what I would do with the leftovers. That's a more open-ended question. And instead I consolidate my attention, and certainly the rest of the family does, on the few things they recognize as the regular things they wish to eat.
Sure.
And that kind of narrowness seems to be terribly problematic, because I know when people say we need to massively scale up industrial and genetic production of new food sources, the argument is if we don't do it that way, then the rest of the world won't be able to get access to the particular kinds of food we're already eating. But the counter argument is, well, couldn't we eat a lot more mushrooms? Couldn't we be eating insects? Isn't there a huge range of other food sources that we could do cheaper and more safely and more nutritiously in a whole other way, but it would require us intersubjectively to agree to look outside of the narrow set of food choices that we're already responding to. That seems to be a very difficult thing to broach.
Yeah, I mean, and to some extent, like something that I've been thinking, something I've been thinking and feeling a lot is one of the big questions in my head is whether we're really exaggerating just how desperate our food access is relative to how much we're wasting. Like that's one of the things that I just like I have to return to that in terms of like when we start considering alternative food sources and alternative ingredients, I continue to wonder, hey, if we just like didn't throw out half of what we made, maybe we could just have a higher quality overall and not throw out food. So that's one of my like kind of gut reactions to that kind of line of thinking. But I do think that one of the ways that we have narrowed our thinking when it comes to food is the idea that this is something that is done on an individual scale, where it's done in a household scale. So rather than considering alternative ingredients and sources for food for calories, essentially, what I would hope to see is people being willing to basically choose together what they're going to eat instead of it being something that like, you decide at 7 in the evening when you're exhausted and don't really want to think about it in the first place. So I think like a flexibility when it comes to our food choices I think we should be focusing more on the actual idea of an individual choosing what's for dinner as opposed to a community choosing what's for dinner. That's one of my big systemic changes that I think needs to happen. There's different ways of thinking about it in terms of the costs and benefits of that when it comes to how people think about their food. And one of the big benefits would be in production, limiting the scope of production for a smaller facility by limiting the basically the scope of what they're producing in a particular time scale, as well as be able to better collaborate with farmers to know what people are actually going to want to consume so that they can plant for that, harvest for that, producers can, process for that and distribute for that in a way that basically leaves behind these kind of points in the process where food is normally being wasted. Now, something that's kind of come up before when I've talked about the idea of basically coordinating what's for dinner, that's like the best way to put it, is that when you produce locally and produce extremely quickly relative to harvest, that food's going to be good for so long. So by the time that it gets into your fridge, you know, most distributed food is still on the truck, making its way across the country. So essentially, it leaves open the option to be able to choose specific time for when you prepare that food and eat it. But in terms of the community intention to like, all right, this is what we're going to do this night, this week, we're going to have this available. It just takes that guesswork out. Essentially, the idea is to minimize the guesswork in the system to be able to produce something that is actually really what people have decided they want to have. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm still kind of speaking vaguely about like how it would function, but that's kind of the bare bones.
It's a good concept. I'm not clear on how people would come to these decisions in a way that was
Yeah.
satisfying.
So essentially the 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 process is Let me actually pull something up because this will help me. Got like a little PowerPoint thing. So I'm just gonna run through this to give a general framework to understand how a community food system might work in terms of a functioning closed loop production system. So essentially, you've got a subscriber community. That's where you start. You have a community who's decided together that they're going to work on their food system and create something local that they can all rely on. So the community drives demand. They shape the entire local food economy through forging local crop contracts with farmers, which stipulate land use standards, including pesticide and fertilizer use. So ahead of any kind of production, basically everybody's coming together and they're agreeing with each other what makes sense, what they can stomach in terms of food production in their community. So that would include everything from the wages of people who are doing the harvesting, the people who are doing the processing. Like I said before, pesticide use. It would include an agreed to price per pound when it comes to particular crops being harvested, everything like that. So then these farmer contracts are formed, and essentially the farmers can rely on these contracts as expectations are clear and comprehensive. So there's no doubt when it comes to the arrangement, they're going to get paid a certain amount depending on what happens. They have a financial settlement in the event of catastrophic crop failure. So one of the things that became really clear to me, in which we haven't talked about at all in terms of the limits of the food system as is that there's this system of crop insurance in the United States, which basically is predetermined state by state which crops are going to be insurable in that state. And so it out the gate, it limits what people are willing to be able, basically how much risk they're able to take on is relative to the access to this insurance. And so the system basically feeds into monoculture growing because there's nothing really to protect a farmer if they decide they're going to do small scale from completely losing, basically having a failed year if there's some kind of catastrophic event in terms of weather, which is something we should think about. So the idea of this is basically to try to is another way to from the ground up to try to start building a more localized production system. Because I don't like the finger waving that happens when it comes to people kind of shaming farmers essentially for not making a switch towards regenerative farming practices or something like that. These are people who have families, who have certain investments, and so rather than kind of like tell them what they should be doing, I'd rather try to encourage them to do better. So that's the idea behind the farmer contracts. So that leads into the local ingredient supply. The local ingredients are planned for in collaboration with the subscriber community, local food processor, and the farmers. And that's basically roughly inventoried and harvested on a weekly basis as crops require. Most localities will require substantial transitions in the number of farmers they work with and the range and volumes of the crops. So that's going to be something that's going to basically happen over time. There might not have, green beans available this year, but everybody by next year agrees that we need to find a farmer who's willing to grow green beans for us. So we're going to come up with a price that is reasonable for a farmer to be able to take on that risk and try to grow green beans for us, right? So in terms of the local ingredient supply, that then feeds into the local food processing stage. Every week, the local food processor will account for inventory from local supply, access to supplemental supply. So essentially, that's like the larger distribution networks that we were discussing. I think it's reasonable to expect that some ingredients are always going to be distributed, more or less, depending on your local region, what they produce, and what the needs are relative to that. So basically, the processor will factor in the total meal demand and curate meal options that are suitable to roughly that same supply. So the local processor is acting like a hub in this situation. They're the ones who are kind of feeding through all this information, and they're the ones that are essentially integrating that memory to be able to utilize it, to be able to produce better over time. So when it comes to the options that they're providing for the meals, let's say this is like 2 weeks ahead of time to when it'll actually be produced. They have their rough inventory. They know what they need to get to be able to supply certain things. And honestly, like some of this system is is based on the assumption, like when I think about what I buy at the grocery store, I have like a very narrow range of things that I'm typically purchasing. There isn't actually that broad of a list that I'm usually bringing in. The random shit that I'm using tends to be specialized ingredients, which are actually really difficult to source a lot of times at a standard grocery store. So the idea behind the local food processing facility is essentially that they would be bringing in any kind of random ingredients, specialized ingredients that are required to be able to make specific meals, which in reality are going to be tastier because they have higher quality ingredients. So let's see. Essentially, the idea is going to be that there's going to be a ranked choice voting system that'll determine the menu for the upcoming week. And the subscribers can then basically choose from those meals. So if you vote on it, there's a little bit of like gamification that I'm imagining in the system too. So you would basically have a vote come up through the app, and part of that link when you go into the voting page is going to be the tally for who has not necessarily specifically who, but what has basically been chosen so far. Like where are things ranking so far in the voting? And the benefit I see to this is that like we should be influencing each other in this way. So it's not, to me, it's not problematic to like see what other people are voting. You're not trying to like, game the system somehow. You're just trying to choose together what makes sense for dinner in a couple of weeks. So I don't know if that makes it more clear, like in terms of that end of things, but it's something that is easy for me to picture when it comes to like the brewing ends. Like I can see this easily happening on the brewing end. I have enough awareness of like the concepts of production in food to expect that this is possible. But the one of the things that's kind of tough going back again to the modeling issue is that like, you know, I don't know how to begin to figure out like the economics of this kind of arrangement in terms of like what would have to be charged for the meals, what we're talking about labor and in terms of making sure that people have living wages. How does that affect the system? I mean, there's many ways in which the existing system is so different that it's almost difficult to apply the same economic modeling to this. So what I've what I've considered is the idea that basically food is one of those things we should be pricing it relative to income, in my opinion. So I think that there's some extent to which within a community, like you should be able to decide basically what portion of your income is reasonable to expect to devote towards food. And what I like about that idea is that it would be a more equitable system. It has the potential to increase quality food access for people who don't have quality food access now. And it also kind of puts the money within the same system for those who already can afford high quality food to be then putting that investment into their community instead of towards a Whole Foods or whatever else that
Do you
they're
think
now
of it as
investing.
working the same for visitors and people passing through communities as it does for permanent residents of communities?
I think there should always be like kind of spot purchasing access when it comes to stuff like this. Like I don't picture this as being like this is the only thing this localized food production does. I just think that it's a way of concentrating the bulk of the effort in production towards very specific ends. So that's really all it's doing when it comes to that. in terms of people who are passing through spot purchases, I think that if this was set up through an app and you had networks of communities who are doing this sort of thing, I don't see why somebody couldn't basically log in as a guest and do purchase, or show up at the production facility and purchase a few meals. I do think that like that kind of flexibility would be important to offer for people who are not specifically looking in terms of committing to a subscriber community.
I like log in as guest. That sounds right.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
community food operating system. So
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
I'm curious how you think about water, because it seems like there's at least three serious issues. Like, in a way, water is our most basic food, and most people's water is not clean enough for our bodies. At the same time, there's a lot of water being seemingly wasted in industrial food production and also in sort of high-end entertainment, pools and
Yeah.
fountains and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then there's a problem of climate change, desertification, the water we need for food production not being where we need it to be,
Hmm.
the irrigation problem. So, do you have thoughts on water and its relevance to all of this?
Yeah. You know, recapturing water, which is typically basically sent to the municipal processing facility, is something that I wish that we were seeing that at breweries. In particular, I think it's about 6 gallons of water are required to produce 1 gallon of beer. So one of the things that I see is I would like to see wherever possible an integration of beverage production with agriculture, at least like aquaponics or something along those lines. So in a system like that, essentially what would happen is when you're doing cleaning of tanks, for example, like you just emptied out a tank, put it into packaging, and the first thing that you do is basically rinse it with a shit ton of water because you're trying to get off as much of the particulate off of the sides of the tank as possible before you actually introduce chemicals. And so the unfortunate thing is that that's just like that's a huge bulk of the waste of the water is just rinsing. And none of that material is rotten. None of it is something that's going to harm the environment and would be best managed on site in gray water, basically gray water pools, where essentially what I'm picturing is a gray water pool that has resident ducks because their poop is directly applicable to plants without burning them, as opposed to chickens, which typically the manure has to be essentially composted before application. So I'd have ducks resident and I would have fish resident as well. So essentially, I'm picturing the ducks, the fish in a pond environment, gray water pond, so that any kind of effluent that basically doesn't have chemical in it would make its way into there. So that would basically act as a source of food for the fish when it comes to all of those little bits that are being rinsed off, for example. And then it ends up feeding into a system which is then being used to grow greens, grow herbs, whatever is reasonable to grow in kind of a localized greenhouse kind of environment or something along those lines. So that's one of the things that I would like to see integrated into systems specifically. When it comes to water management and irrigation, I just think that we need to take these as like really serious decisions as far as what should we be growing. That's like really where the should kind of comes into the farming part. So in certain regions they might not require irrigation. The irrigation might be very limited based on the climate. In other areas, it really might not be reasonable to do things outside. You might want to have something more enclosed and have a water management system like I'm discussing. Yeah. Other than that, I mean, I think that the water issue is definitely a bigger one in my mind. Including I've been trying to like educate myself a bit more in terms of issues surrounding the ocean. because one of the big glaring things that I've noticed about what I've been contemplating is that it doesn't account for the ocean at all. And so really the best way I can think of to try to relieve some of that stress, in terms of the earth, would be to do more very small scale fish farming locally. So that's really where my thinking is at this moment. When it comes to water supply and safety, yeah, it's a tricky one. Like at our in our neighborhood right now, we're actually like in a bit of a dispute with the local municipality because the EPA years back, came through and basically determined that all of our wells were too close to the septics, essentially, and or too shallow, to be safe. And so, we're trying to work with them to be able to figure out how to transition to a safer system at this moment. And I don't think that we're that unusual in terms of having that sort of issue come up. Yeah, I think that as much as possible to feed a lot of like the waste management and resource management through localized hubs would be of benefit. So having water treatment happen and in the same proximity, I don't think would be a bad decision. Having composting, community composting on site would be a good thing to have. There's all sorts of ways that we could kind of manage these things so that they're more transparent. And generally speaking, I think that that's kind of the direction that we need to move towards, is that greater transparency overall, more internalized testing, more more kind of like community engagement when it comes to the decisions about how all of it's being done. Oh,
So what?
sorry.
Yeah.
I have one more thing. I have one more thing. This is actually a big one. This is a big one. That's why I'm interrupting. So like the other thing in terms of water management is we've gotta fucking stop growing turf. We've gotta stop growing turf. Like the amount of land that's just covered with ecologically useless turf, which is then cared for with chemicals, which is then cared for with irrigation, which is then cared for with some kind of usually gas powered device, lawnmower. Like this is just like the most insane thing that we're doing right now is we're growing a crop that has no use whatsoever. There's maybe limited spaces where I can see it making sense to have turf, like where you're actually going to be using it for games or something along those lines. But the idea that people just like have these lawns at their houses, there's industrial parks that are just covered with turf. This is a huge waste. This is kind of another part of the PACE system. So in terms of the post anthropogenic or anthropocentric ecological stewardship, part of it is the idea of replacing a lot of these things that we just take as like for granted in terms of how yards look, how developed spaces look. And we should be planting native plants as much as possible, which also actually help with water retention in the soil. They help with water filtration going through the root systems. It generally is regenerative to local populations of native species. Something that people don't often think about is the fact that the plants are the thing that make that energy useful to us in terms of calories. And so whether you're an insect or a human, we require those plants to be there to be able to get that energy from the sun into our bodies somehow. And so when it comes to planting native plants, we're essentially creating the basis for a network which is self-sustaining rather than something that we're constantly having to feed with chemicals, water, and work.
It's an interesting feature of this is that however we set it up, it's going to have to be very flexible and very adaptable if the climate situation is going to be unpredictable going forward. then we need to be able to constantly update and change what and how we're growing in any particular region. Yeah, that's not a question, just a comment. What I really want to ask here, because I guess we're coming toward the end, is what important things, what do you need to know that you still don't know? And what kind of help do you need in order to take this to the next step?
So the most important thing is that I don't have the skills to be able to develop an app. So that's really the biggest thing. And I think like the more I thought about the system and how it could function, the more critical it seemed to me that there'd be essentially like an all-inclusive app. So something that I haven't mentioned yet is that I think this should also be integrated in terms of the labor itself. So when it comes to the networking with the farmers, one of the big issues that you'll find in smaller scale farming is that farmers will, get the seeds in, their plants are doing great, everything's awesome, and then they come to harvest and there aren't enough hands available to harvest. So they end up having basically to come to this decision about whether or not it's even worth the investment of harvesting in the first place in some cases. So, an app I would imagine could be a place where essentially a farmer could request or put out a flag to say, hey, I need a hand with harvesting X, Y, and Z around this time. I'm looking for this many people. And in an app environment, I could see people receiving that message. Hey, I've got some extra time this weekend. You want to go harvest with me or whatever? A bunch of friends could go over and earn a little bit of extra money over the weekend helping out with harvest, right? So there's a lot of kind of moving parts to me in terms of what an app would look like on that end, as well as when it comes to inventory management. So I think that the communication between the farmers and the processing facility needs to be relatively seamless in order for this to function as well as I would like to see it function. So they would need to be able to basically say, hey, like let's say there's a weekly estimate that the farmer sends out. They've got crops that are, basically going to be ready to harvest in the not too distant future. This would be a space where they could basically have a tool to be able to estimate, all right, well, there's about like right now I'm seeing about 20 peppers per plant are about ready, are going to be about ready to harvest in a few days from now. So within the app, I think they should be able to calculate that out for the number of plants that they have, submit it to the processing facility, and now the processing facility has an approximation of how many peppers are going to be available to be able to dedicate towards meals. So so yeah, I think like these are all things that when taken in isolation would be extremely difficult to manage. But if they're integrated in one tool, I think that there's a lot of potential for streamlining production through an app like that. But like I said, I have no way. I do not have those skills to be able to develop it itself. So there's that. Oh, and then on the other end of it too, as far as the inventory management, I think that it would be a cool way of basically sending out notices of like a bulk harvest. So let's say there was a bulk harvest of tomatoes, and now we've got like, I don't know, 100 pounds of tomatoes out of nowhere, and we're only going to be able to use so many in our production, and so there's like we have this excess. This would be a space to be able to let people know, hey, we have this many pounds of tomatoes, like basically reserve yours now. Like you can reserve them here and reserve them. And yeah, I think that something like this that's all integrated in the same space would be really crucial for this. So that's one thing. Next stages, one of the big concerns that I have is that I just don't know how deep the regulatory hole is going to be in terms of addressing licensing and what kinds of requirements are going to you know basically depending on the local community, there's going to be very different requirements, and so I don't know what's going to be federally regulated, what's going to be state regulated, local municipality. So there's some part of this which is kind of a legal component, which I do not have the tools to be able to sort out. And then when it comes to like actually making this happen, I'm really like hoping to find a handful of communities that are already basically forming on their own, because I think that that's kind of something in terms of introducing the model and experimenting with early models, that it would be best to kind of do that with people who are already in that mindset. So I think over time there's a lot of potential for and I'm sort of using this word on purpose, but I think there's a lot of potential for converting people towards wanting this sort of food system. But there's like those early adopters are going to need to be different types of people than people who, they've seen the system working or whatever. So so yeah, I'm looking for communities who are interested in exploring this. I think that early models would have to kind of be much more flexible in terms of working out glitches to the system, willing to kind of like play around, dedicate a little bit more time towards its development. And then, lastly, like I've mentioned, for any of this to function, it's going to require a lot of capital investment when it comes to an actual production facility. So I'm aware of, just from working in various scales of craft beer, I'm aware of the ways that you can scale production kind of gradually, so that there isn't as much of a deep hole that you get into right out the gate. And I think actually that's something that communities should actually be a part of as well. So as they see their community growing, they should be able to decide based on the success of the community, based on how much the community wants to grow potentially, in terms of how they want to see investments coming back into the system towards more equipment, better equipment, expansions on facilities, things like that. So yeah, I think investors, communities, app development, legal support. Those are like the big things that I'm looking for right now.
But economic expertise, investors, software
Yeah.
partners, and communication with other communities who might already be experimenting with some version of new food systems.
Yeah.
If people wanted to find out more about how you've been thinking about it or wanted to get involved, where would they go? Is there some place for them to check out? Is there some way to contact you? Like, what would be the actual function there?
So I have a website that I have not actually at this moment published, but let me just pull it up so I don't get it wrong. I'm fairly certain that it is pacelife.org. So that would be spelled PAES life, LIFE.org. And I'll make sure that I have some email contact in there. Hopefully I'll get some kind of presentation on there just to be able to give a good overview. There's a lot of elements I actually didn't get a chance to discuss, believe it or not. And one of the big things that I'll just throw out there to put in people's heads is that we need to have closed loop packaging systems. So some way of basically moving away from plastics and plastic use in packaging as much as possible. I think that's something we've just kind of sort of accepted and take for granted. And yeah, anyways, I really look forward to talking with anybody who's interested in exploring this concept. I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to talk with me about it. And yeah, I mean, if there's a point where you'd be willing to dive into specific elements deeper, then I'd be happy to do that
Yeah, let's
too.
do that again because I'm not surprised that there are elements you haven't gotten to. I feel like we're barely scratching the surface of this
Yeah,
thing, and it's one
yeah,
of the most essential things. So
yeah,
this
yeah.
ongoing conversation, and let's do
Okay.
whatever we can to start linking people together who might have some energy to work on this.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. It's a good time.